The eviction notice was taped to my bakery door, half buried under fresh snow. After 20 years of fighting, this was it, the absolute last day Hayes Bakery would ever open in downtown Sioux Falls. My greedy brother-in-law had finally won, jacking up the rent through his shell company until I couldn't afford another month. I'd already boxed up Grandma's recipe cards and shut down the ovens for good. The place stood empty, silent, defeated. Then a black SUV pulled up outside. Two women stepped out into the swirling snow, boots crunching on the salted sidewalk. They pushed through the door, shaking flakes from their expensive coats. The younger one looked straight at me with sharp, warm, familiar eyes that stopped me cold. She smiled like she already knew every secret I'd been carrying for 2 decades. That's when everything I thought I'd lost was about to come roaring back. 20 years ago, I fed a homeless girl in my small bakery. Now, as my life fell apart and the shop closed forever, 2 strangers walked in and the truth was finally exposed. This is how one act of kindness tore my family apart, then delivered the most satisfying revenge I never saw coming. Let me take you back to where this all started, 2 decades earlier when golden leaves covered the streets of Sioux Falls. I was 30, fresh from baking school with more dreams than sense, and I'd come home to care for Grandma Thelma. Her heart was giving out slowly that summer, making even simple tasks exhausting. We'd sit together on the porch at sunset while she told stories about opening the bakery back when downtown was just dirt roads and a handful of shops. Her wrinkled hands would hold mine as she shared recipes passed down through generations, explaining how fresh bread could fix almost any bad day. Those quiet moments felt precious, especially watching her energy fade week by week. My older sister Tamara would visit occasionally, always with that polished smile and questions about Grandma's health. But I noticed how her conversations drifted toward the house, the savings, the future, like she was already calculating what might come next. She'd moved away years before, building a life with her husband Larry Santos in a bigger home filled with expensive furniture and ambitious plans. When she dropped by, she brought small gifts, but her eyes lingered on family photos and the deed papers Grandma kept in the drawer. It wasn't obvious at first, just subtle hints about making sure everything's in order or thinking ahead. I brushed it off as concern, but something in her tone made my stomach twist. Grandma passed peacefully one night in her sleep. The doctor said it was simply her time, nothing unexpected. I found her in the morning looking serene, almost smiling, as if she drifted off after hearing a beautiful story. We buried her quietly with just family and close friends at the small cemetery on the edge of town. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant snow as we stood there, and I clung to memories of her laughter echoing through the bakery kitchen. A week later, we gathered in the lawyer's office downtown to hear the will. The room smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the kind of place where life-changing decisions happen without fanfare. Tamara inherited the big family house on the hill, plus most of Grandma's savings, money earned from decades behind the counter, pinching every penny. I received the little downtown bakery with its worn floors and empty display cases, along with something far more valuable than I realized. A 50-year lease Grandma had signed decades ago, locking in ridiculously low rent that nobody could touch. She'd always been proud of that lease, calling it her way of keeping the place in the family, protected from greedy landlords and rising costs. Hearing it read aloud brought tears streaming down my face. It felt like Grandma's final hug, her trust that I'd carry on what she loved most. If you want the full truth about what happened next, hit like so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. Right after the funeral, while we were still in the church hall surrounded by casseroles from neighbors, Larry pulled me aside. He was a local real estate developer who always seemed to know which properties would skyrocket in value. He leaned in with that confident nod and offered to buy out the lease for what sounded generous to him, but felt insultingly low to me. Enough for a small down payment somewhere else, but nowhere near what the location might be worth someday. He framed it as a favor, a practical way to help me get out from under the burden and start fresh. I could see Tamara watching nearby with quiet approval. But selling felt like betrayal. The bakery wasn't a burden, it was home. It was Grandma's legacy, the place where I'd spent childhood afternoons kneading dough beside her, learning resilience along with recipes. I thanked him politely but said no. I believed I could make it work alone, pictured reopening those doors and filling the air with cinnamon and vanilla again, turning it into something that honored her memory. Larry nodded like he understood, but his eyes held that developer glint, like he was already calculating his next move. From that day forward, things between Tamara and me cooled permanently. Phone calls grew shorter, visits rarer, and when we did talk, the words stayed surface level, careful, polite, but missing all warmth. I threw myself into fixing up the bakery, sanding Grandma's old counters, testing recipes late into the night, telling myself this was the right path. But deep down, I felt the first real crack in our family, a fracture that started small but promised to widen into something I couldn't repair. Just a few weeks after the funeral, on a winter evening when snow fell thick and heavy, I was closing up late. The streets outside had gone quiet under the white blanket when I heard something from the alley behind the shop. At first I thought it was wind rattling the dumpster, but then I heard it again, a small, shivering sound that didn't belong to any animal. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, stepping out into the biting cold. There, huddled against the wall near the back door, was a 9-year-old girl named Tegan Patel, curled up in a thin jacket that was no match for South Dakota winter. Her lips were blue, her eyes wide with hunger and fear. My heart ached the second I saw her. I knelt down slowly so I wouldn't scare her more and asked if she was okay. She didn't answer at first, just stared at me with those dark, wary eyes. But when I mentioned warm bread inside, she nodded slightly. I helped her up. She weighed almost nothing, and brought her into the bakery, locking the door against the storm. I sat her at the counter, wrapped her in one of Grandma's old aprons for extra warmth, and gave her fresh cinnamon rolls still hot from the oven plus a bowl of hearty vegetable soup. She ate slowly at first, then faster, like she was afraid it might vanish. Watching her, I felt something protective and tender rise up, the same feeling Grandma used to have when she fed neighborhood kids during hard times. Over the next few days, I let her sleep in the storage room on a cot with extra blankets. She was quiet but polite, thanking me every time I brought food. As we talked more, I discovered how incredibly brilliant Tegan was. I'd mention a recipe once, and she'd remember every ingredient and step perfectly. She'd watch me calculate supply costs, then suggest quicker ways to add them up in her head, always accurate. Soon she started offering simple but genius ideas for the bakery, rearranging the display case to show bestsellers first, grouping similar flavors so customers could find what they wanted faster. Those small changes made a real difference, drawing in more locals who appreciated the thoughtful layout. One regular who noticed the improvements was Juanita Weber, an older customer and retired real estate lawyer who came in most afternoons for tea and a scone. She took immediate interest in Tegan, sitting with her at a table, and asking gentle questions about books or puzzles the girl liked. Juanita quickly saw the same spark I did, spending time encouraging her, bringing library books or math games that Tegan devoured in hours. Watching them together warmed me, like witnessing a quiet mentorship form right in front of the pastry case. Comment justice if you believe what's coming next was deserved. Tegan stayed and helped for a few months, and during that time, the bakery felt alive in a new way. More customers came, lingering longer, chatting with us both. I taught her basic baking skills, how to fold butter into dough for perfect croissants, how to temper chocolate for decorations, and her quick hands and sharp mind made everything easier. Those months brought light into my days, easing the grief that still lingered after losing Grandma. Having Tegan there filled the shop with laughter and purpose, reminding me why I'd fought to keep the place open. The following spring, a kind family from Omaha drove to Sioux Falls to foster and eventually adopt Tegan. Saying goodbye was harder than I expected. She hugged me tight, promising in her serious little voice that she'd never forget what I'd done. As their car pulled away, I stood in the doorway watching until they disappeared, feeling the bakery quieter than it had been in months, but carrying a gentle hope that kindness like this might circle back someday. After Tegan left, she left behind a short handwritten note on the counter, folded neatly with my name on the outside in careful child's printing. Inside, she thanked me for the food, the warm place, and the chance to help, ending with a promise that she'd come back one day to repay the kindness when she was grown. I slipped that note into the drawer beneath the register, pulling it out on slow days when the bakery felt too large and empty without her energy. It became my private source of comfort, a reminder that even brief connections could leave something meaningful behind. Not long after Tegan's departure, letters from Larry and Tamara started arriving more frequently, each one outlining a new offer to purchase the lease at prices noticeably lower than before. The envelopes bore Larry's development company letterhead, the wording courteous on the surface, positioning the proposals as thoughtful ways to ease my supposed burdens. Reading them alone in the quiet back room after locking up, I felt growing unease settle over me, a sense that these weren't mere suggestions, but calculated steps meant to wear down my confidence over time. I organized them into a dedicated folder, determined not to let printed words push me into a decision I wasn't ready to make. They also started using relationships at City Hall to file minor, yet persistently annoying zoning complaints. Reports citing noise from the oven starting early mornings, or customers occasionally parking longer than allowed in the shared lot out front. Inspectors appeared without warning, equipped with clipboards and measuring tools, asking to record sound levels or document vehicle positions. Although the matters never escalated to actual violations or penalties, the unexpected visits disrupted the daily rhythm and left me constantly watchful. It created an atmosphere of ongoing tension, like the bakery had become subject to scrutiny that lingered just below the surface, wearing away at the peace I'd worked hard to maintain. Tamara would drop by occasionally, selecting coffee and a pastry before settling at the counter long enough to inquire about my well-being and the shop's progress. She always framed her questions with apparent concern, gradually steering the conversation toward observations about how much easier life could be if I sold, allowing myself relief from constant demands. Her tone carried that familiar polished quality, but I detected the underlying intent, the subtle expectation that persistence would eventually sway me. Those encounters left me emotionally exhausted, amplifying the distance that had steadily widened between us since Grandma's passing, turning what used to be sisterly visits into something strained and purposeful. Juanita continued her routine stops for afternoon tea, picking up on subtle changes in my demeanor and the increasing pile of official correspondence tucked behind the counter. One particularly quiet afternoon, after the rush had faded and the shop stood empty, we sat together at a small table by the window as daylight softened outside. She took her time explaining the genuine worth embedded in the old lease, focusing especially on the air rights provision that granted control over potential development above the building. She pointed out how those rights could appreciate substantially as downtown Sioux Falls gradually transformed into a more active commercial district, with announcements of new office buildings and retail projects starting to circulate among local business owners. Listening to her measured, experienced perspective provided a much-needed boost, strengthening my belief that clinging to the lease represented not only sentimental attachment, but also prudent foresight Grandma had built into it decades earlier. Type yes if you want to see how this all ends. The years that followed passed with brutal hardships, especially through the long, freezing South Dakota winters. The financial crisis hit hard, wiping out savings everywhere and bringing fewer customers through the door as people tightened their belts. Foot traffic slowed to a trickle some weeks, and I had to cut back on staff, handling most shifts alone while watching supply costs rise and sales drop lower. Mornings started earlier to save on electricity, nights ended later cleaning up what little there was, and I learned to stretch every dollar further than I thought possible. The quiet during slow hours gave me too much time to think about how close I was to losing it all, the place that had become my whole world after Grandma was gone. Then came the pandemic, closing everything for months and forcing me to pivot to limited takeout just to stay afloat, all while worrying about health and bills piling up in ways I never imagined. I set up a small window for orders, baking less variety to avoid waste, and wore masks long after others stopped, cautious because the shop was my only income. Customers who did come thanked me for staying open, sharing stories of their own struggles over wrapped packages, and those brief exchanges became small anchors in days that blurred together with isolation and uncertainty. Larry used a shell company to buy the building itself, and soon after he raised the rent significantly, claiming minor improvements like repainting or fixing a few fixtures. The increases felt unfair, stretching the budget thinner each time and making it harder to keep the lights on and the ovens running through freezing months when heating costs soared. I negotiated where I could, but new demands always came at the worst moments, forcing choices between paying suppliers or covering the higher lease. It added a constant undercurrent of stress, turning what used to be joyful baking into a daily calculation of survival. I came close to closing several times, staring at empty shelves and red numbers in the books, wondering if I could hold on any longer. Those moments alone after closing, with snow piling against the windows and silence pressing in, brought waves of doubt that made me question every decision I'd made since refusing to sell. But whenever the situation seemed hopeless, an anonymous money order would arrive in the mail, always for the exact amount needed to cover the most pressing expense, whether a new refrigerator part, emergency repairs, or overdue utilities. Those unmarked envelopes became quiet lifelines, arriving without explanation but with perfect timing, giving me the breathing room to push forward one more season. I never knew who sent them, but they restored a fragile faith that someone out there still cared about small places like mine. Juanita quietly helped me gather and organize every piece of correspondence, receipt, and complaint notice over the years, building a careful record of the ongoing harassment. She never pushed, just offered steady advice during her visits, reminding me that documentation could matter someday when the time was right. Her calm presence over tea became one of the few constants, gentle encouragement that kept me from giving up entirely on the idea of justice. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding beneath the surface. Tamara appeared less and less in person, her visits replaced by short phone calls or emails that always circled back to the same suggestion about one last chance to sell. The conversations grew briefer, the silences longer, until contact felt more like obligation than connection, leaving me with a hollow ache for the closeness we once shared. I missed the sister who used to laugh with me in Grandma's kitchen, but that version seemed lost somewhere along the way, replaced by distance I didn't know how to bridge. Many years later, in another cold December in Sioux Falls, I hung the closing forever sign on the door because I could no longer afford the latest rent demand. The numbers didn't add up anymore, no matter how many times I recalculated or cut corners. After exhausting every possible way to stretch the budget further, I accepted that it was time to let go. The bakery, once filled with comforting scents of fresh dough and vanilla, now stood stripped and silent, the display cases bare, the ovens cold for good. Walking through the empty space that morning, I touched the worn counter where Grandma had rolled out countless pies, feeling the finality settle over me like the heavy snow outside. Tamara stopped by one last time, stepping in from the snow with a coat that looked new and expensive against the drab interior. She glanced around the bare space and said a few smug words along the lines of, "Finally, you're giving up. You should have sold long ago and avoided all this suffering." Her voice carried satisfaction, as if the outcome proved her right all along and justified every suggestion she'd made over the years. I managed to nod, keeping my response short to avoid giving her more satisfaction, and watched her leave without much more than a quick goodbye. The door closed behind her, and I was alone again in the place that had been my entire life for 2 decades. I spent that last afternoon boxing up the remaining items, Grandma's old mixing bowls, a few photo frames, the worn aprons we'd used for years. Each object felt heavy with memory, reminders of better days when the place buzzed with customers and the air smelled like hope. I kept looking at that handwritten note from Tegan, reading her childish promise one more time before tucking it into my pocket. It felt like the only thing I had left to hold on to. If this shocked you, comment revenge below. The eviction notice was still taped to the door, half covered in fresh snow, when I heard the engine outside. I assumed it was just someone parking nearby, but then I heard footsteps approaching and the door pushed open, bringing in a rush of cold air. 2 women entered, shaking snow from their expensive coats, and I looked up from the boxes, ready to tell them we were closed for good. That's when I saw her eyes. The younger woman stepped forward, and something about her stopped me cold. Those eyes, sharp, warm, impossibly familiar, held mine for a long moment before she smiled. "Hi, Genesis," she said softly. "It's been a long time." My breath caught. "Tegan." She nodded, and suddenly I saw the 9-year-old girl I'd fed 2 decades ago, now grown into a confident, successful woman in her late 20s. The other woman beside her extended a hand. "I'm Maria Chen, Tegan's business partner and attorney." Her handshake was firm, professional, carrying the weight of someone who meant business. Tegan looked around the empty bakery, her expression mixing sadness with something else, something that looked like determination. "I got your closing notice," she said. "I've been keeping tabs on this place for years, and I know exactly what's been happening to you." I felt my throat tighten. You've been watching." "More than watching." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been documenting every rent increase, every bogus inspection, every harassment tactic your brother-in-law used through his shell company. Genesis, what they did to you wasn't just cruel, it was illegal." My hands started shaking. "The money orders," I whispered. "That was you." Tegan's eyes softened. "You saved my life when I was 9 years old. You gave me food, warmth, and something even more valuable. You showed me that kindness exists in this world. That one act changed everything for me. My adoptive family gave me opportunities, helped me get through school, and I worked my way through MIT on scholarships and sheer determination. I built a tech company focused on financial transparency software, tracking shell companies and fraudulent real estate practices. I became exactly the kind of person who could help you fight back." Maria stepped forward, opening the folder on the counter. "We've spent the last 6 months building a case. Larry Santos used offshore shell companies to acquire this property, then systematically harassed you through false complaints and rent manipulation designed to force you out so he could develop the property. What he didn't realize is that your lease includes air rights, the ability to control development above this building. Do you know what those rights are worth in downtown Sioux Falls right now?" I shook my head, barely able to process what I was hearing. "Conservative estimates put them between $2 and $4 million, Maria said calmly. "The city's been approving high-rise developments all around this area. Larry knew this. That's why he's been trying to get you out for 20 years. He wanted those air rights for himself, and he was willing to destroy you to get them." The room spun. $4 million. The lease Grandma had given me, the one I'd barely understood, was worth that much. Tegan placed her hand over mine. "We're not going to let him win. Maria and I have already filed complaints with the state attorney general's office documenting the shell company fraud, the harassment campaign, and the attempted theft of your air rights. We've also secured funding to cover all your legal costs and back rent so you can reopen this bakery properly. But more than that," she smiled, and it was fierce, "we're going to make sure Larry and Tamara face consequences for what they did." Over the next 3 months, everything moved faster than I could have imagined. Maria's legal team worked with state investigators to unravel Larry's network of shell companies, discovering he'd used similar tactics on at least 5 other small business owners across South Dakota. The pattern was clear. Identify properties with valuable leases or air rights, acquire the buildings through shell companies, then systematically harass tenants until they gave up and sold for pennies on the dollar. Reports started surfacing that Larry had been under investigation for months before Tegan even got involved. Prosecutors built a case around real estate fraud, criminal harassment, and conspiracy to commit theft through coercion. The evidence Juanita and I had gathered, every letter, every inspection report, every documented rent increase, became crucial pieces of the puzzle. Tamara tried to distance herself at first, claiming she had no knowledge of Larry's business practices. But email records subpoenaed during discovery told a different story. She'd been actively involved in strategizing how to pressure me, even suggesting specific complaints to file at City Hall. Her name appeared on documents connected to the shell companies, listed as a silent partner in several of Larry's development projects. The air rights revelation became the bombshell that changed everything. Once independent appraisers confirmed the multi-million-dollar value, it became clear that Larry had been attempting to defraud me of a fortune. Under South Dakota law, that elevated the charges significantly. Legal proceedings took months, but the outcome was devastating for Larry and Tamara. Larry was convicted of multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 6 years in prison, with orders to pay restitution to all the business owners he'd targeted. His real estate empire collapsed almost overnight as investors pulled out and properties were seized to cover damages. Tamara avoided prison but faced steep fines, community service, and the permanent destruction of her reputation in Sioux Falls. Their big house on the hill, the one she'd inherited from Grandma, had to be sold to cover legal fees and restitution payments. Drop a like, comment about a time someone tried to take advantage of you, and subscribe for more stories about justice finally being served. We share real accounts of people who fought back and won. Meanwhile, Tegan and Maria helped me not just reopen Hayes Bakery, but transform it into something bigger. Using a portion of the air rights value, which we negotiated selling to a development company for $3.2 million, we renovated the entire space, installed state-of-the-art equipment, and expanded into the adjacent storefront that had been sitting empty for years. We created a training program for young people from difficult backgrounds, teaching them baking skills and business fundamentals, exactly the kind of opportunity Tegan had needed when she was 9. Tegan became a silent partner, refusing any publicity but insisting on being involved in the training program. Juanita, now in her 80s, still comes in most afternoons for tea, sitting at her favorite table with a satisfied smile, knowing her quiet guidance all those years helped make this possible. The bakery thrives now in ways I never imagined during those dark years of struggle. The morning lines stretched down the block, filled with locals who heard the story and wanted to support a business that refused to be crushed by greed. We named our best-selling cinnamon rolls Tegan's Promise, in honor of the girl who kept her word across 20 years and thousands of miles. As for Tamara, I haven't spoken to her since the trial. She tried reaching out once through a mutual acquaintance, suggesting we move past what happened, but I wasn't ready. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive the betrayal, the years of calculated cruelty, the way she smiled while watching me suffer. But that day hasn't come yet. What I learned through all of this is that kindness isn't weakness, and patience isn't surrender. Sometimes the good you put into the world takes decades to circle back, but when it does, it can change everything. Grandma Thelma knew what she was doing when she gave me that lease with its hidden air rights provision. She was protecting not just a building, but a legacy, banking on the hope that someone in the family would have the strength to hold on when times got hard. I held on, and in the end, with help from a 9-year-old girl who never forgot a warm cinnamon roll on a freezing night, we won. Hayes Bakery isn't just surviving now. It's thriving, training the next generation, and standing as proof that sometimes, the people who try to tear you down end up building your greatest victory. The eviction notice that once hung on my door now sits framed in my office, a reminder of how close I came to losing everything and how far we've come since that snowy December day when 2 strangers walked in and changed my life forever.